So Bitcoin needs a network of keys. Let me describe what I think is about to happen. All right. So if you've been in Bitcoin for a long time, did you imagine that the world would be like what it is now, right? Like, when did you think Bitcoin would hit 100K? When did you think there would be a strategic Bitcoin reserve, right? When did you think there would be, all this attention and mainstream acknowledgement and so on? Who knows, right? It feels really good. But we all know that Bitcoin also has tremendous challenges that it must overcome if it is not just to be a story, but actually a movement that succeeds, right? Like we have what, 100 million people worldwide maybe that own Bitcoin? Like, how is that going to turn into billions, right? I don't know. We've got to scale payments. It is really cool that you can transfer $1 billion of value for a few dollars in fees, right? That's really cool. But if it also costs you often a few dollars to transfer a few dollars, that's not a payment system, right? We're not going to be able to turn Bitcoin into a medium of exchange if we don't figure out a way to scale payments. And I think most near and dear to my heart is the idea of consolidation in custody, right? Like I am terrified of this specter, right? Like Coinbase right now, just to pick one example, is sitting on something like 750,000 coins. Like I've heard estimates as high as 2 million. I'm not really sure how to believe it. It's not an easy number to look up always. You might imagine that as the CEO, or excuse me, as the co-founder of a Bitcoin collaborative custody company like Unchained, I would be really excited for Coinbase to get taken down and hacked, and everyone would realize how important it is to practice self-custody and collaborative custody and all this stuff. But absolutely not, guys. I'm terrified of an outcome like that. A Mt. Gox-style hack on Coinbase today would be an apocalyptic event, right? It would set Bitcoin back a decade or more. And I don't want it to occur, yet I can't stop it because I'm not at Coinbase. So I really worry about these issues. And ultimately, I think that the solution to all of these issues, these onboarding issues, the scaling issues, the custody centralization issues, is something I call a network of keys. It is Bitcoiners in collaboration, in communication, in coordination with each other using cryptographic primitives such as Bitcoin private keys. And I'm going to show a bunch of examples of that. But because I think this is a network, and I also think it's a market, and I think it's a bunch of other things, I got a bunch of abstract ideas about it. But for today, because I think it's a network, I wish that we as Bitcoiners understood networks a little bit better. And so I want to try and do a little bit of a fun science 101 class on complex network theory. And I should mention, I have some minor qualifications in this regard. I've had 3 major beats in my life that have been lived here in Austin. I moved here in 2005 to start a PhD program at the university up there. I seldom came downtown except for to go to Dirty Sixth every now and again, but I researched networks and a lot of the stuff that I'll be showing you I was participating in. At some point I met Joe and he convinced me to drop out, and we started a big data and distributed systems and cloud computing company called InfoChimps in 2008. Y'all, South by was like the event of the year for me in that era, right? It was one of the biggest networking and potentially fundraising opportunities. I loved going to all the stuff. It also used to be cooler, let's be honest. And it's ironic that now that I'm in Bitcoin and financial services and collaborative custody and all this stuff, I don't care about South by. It's completely useless to me. And events like this are so much more satisfying and so much more helpful. So thank you, everybody who puts this stuff on. I'm glad to be part of the takeover with you. I intend to never go to South by Southwest again. I guess what I'm trying to say is my past is inextricable from my present, right? Everything that I've done in my life seems to have prepared me for exactly this moment to be on stage with you. I'm kind of like, I suppose, a blockchain, or aren't we all? I don't know. Maybe everything is Bitcoin. Hard to say. Okay, let me tell you why I think networks are so interesting and why I was interested in them even 20 years ago when I was in college and in graduate school. I think ultimately the answer is networks are about relationships. It's a science of how things are connected, not what they are. And that means the tools, the models, the methodology of network science can be broadly applied in a whole bunch of different areas, and we can learn about different areas using the same tools. I think it's very cool. I'll just show you some pictures, right? Here's a picture of like a kind of a social network you may have seen. I even forgot where this one is from. You got different people of different types all connected. There's some patterns. We'll talk about that. Here's a pretty cool one. This is, the international network of airplanes and flights and what routes exist, right? On the top right, you can sort of see it laid out geographically, but I think it's more interesting, and often is with networks, to look at it laid out structurally, right in the bottom. And you can kind of see things like Canada has totally disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore because it's just a small set of airports at the top left over there. It's mostly just, North America, Europe, and Asia. And you can sort of see how impoverished Africa is as a continent by its lack of presence in this structure. And perhaps conversely, how overrepresented the Middle East is in terms of wealth and connectivity at its sort of place as the crossroads between 3 major continents, right? So all that becomes pretty easy when you lay it out this way. Here's another similar network diagram, right? This is undersea cables that are transmitting the internet and indeed crucial to Bitcoin's success, and maybe something I hope we can replace with something that looks a little bit more decentralized over time, but that's a different talk. There's also this network, right? This is power, right? Like all the power interconnects and so on in the United States. Somehow there's supposed to be like a gap around Texas, right? Like ERCOT is its own thing. Maybe you can sort of see that on here, not clear. This is a really cool one. This is your metabolism, right? You're doing this network right now inside of you, right? Some of you harder than others. There's something in the middle there, which is a circle, right? The Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle. I've become incredibly fascinated with the Krebs cycle recently for reasons that have to do, believe it or not, with Bitcoin and AI. But again, that's a different talk. Here's a bunch of telecoms in Europe and how they connect to each other and route traffic. This is a really interesting one. I put this one up because of Becca. And I knew that she was talking right before me, right? This is a network of insurers and reinsurers in the Brazilian market that I pulled from some paper, right? The notion is that reinsurers have to protect insurers, right? They have to be able, if one fails, that kind of liability has to roll up somewhere. And so there's a network of liability that they have to understand in their industry in order to be able to service Brazilians. This is a cool network. This is the Lightning Network, or at least it's someone's attempt at drawing the Lightning Network, right? A whole bunch of stuff connected in the corner, and then lots of nodes that are kind of hanging out by themselves. Maybe they haven't figured out how to use it yet. I don't know. Okay, pretty pictures aside, what does this have to do with Bitcoin? My claim is everything, right? Bitcoin is full of networks in all sorts of ways. It is most obviously itself a peer-to-peer network, literally. That's how the mempool and the blockchain work. We're all gossiping information back and forth on the internet. But that's one of the network aspects of Bitcoin I'm least interested in, to be honest, right? You can look at UTXOs as well. UTXOs are themselves the leaves of a long tree, a network of transactions, right? What does that acronym even mean? Unspent transaction output, right? It's a leaf at one of those trees. Platforms like what Unchained has built and many others, like these are collaborative custody platforms in which users are sharing keys. These are interesting networks, and I think these are the ones I'm most interested in. Obviously, this is where I work at Unchained. Layer 2, Lightning is a network of payment channels. Bitcoiners, ourselves, we are a community. We have a social network structure amongst us, which is interesting to think about and talk about, and perhaps itself an origin for attack vectors. Who knows? But the claim I want to come back to over and over again, despite all these different kinds of networks, it's really the network of keys that is, I think, the most important to scaling Bitcoin and solving all those problems that I set out at the top. So we're going to do a quick 4-slide crash course in network science, the kind of thing that I was working on when I first moved to Austin 20 years ago. Okay, so here's a cool slide. This is a really cool idea, very simple idea, and we'll come back to it a bunch of times. Doing good on time. Okay, so phase changes in connectivity, right? So imagine that you have a network, right? And networks are, by the way, I didn't say it, but I think everyone has an intuitive picture. They're nodes and edges, right? There's some sort of way to describe connectivity and shape. So say I have 50 nodes. How many connections can exist between those 50 nodes? Well, it's approximately n squared connections. It's not exactly, it's n squared, n times n minus 1 over 2 or whatever. But if I have 50 nodes, I'm going to have roughly 1,200 connections possibly that I can put between those nodes. How many connections have to be in this network? If I'm just putting, let's just say I'm putting them randomly, how many connections need to be in this network before it becomes completely connected? All right, the answer is way less than n squared. Right? It turns out you approximately only need about n connections if you want the whole network to become connected, for there to be a path between any node and any other node. And you can kind of see that here when I'm drawing these random connections. If I have 10 and 30, that's not enough. There's whole sections of the network are completely unreachable. But as soon as I get to about 50, yeah, almost the entire network is indeed connected. And if I go more, then it gets over-connected and so on. What's really interesting is the guy who originally studied this, there were many, but in particular, he was one of them, Paul Erdős, identified this as a kind of phase change. Right? Similar to a way that liquids can melt or freeze, and that we call that a phase change. It's a very similar idea here. That kind of stuff is happening, and globally the network is not created. And then very suddenly, as we get to approximately as many nodes as we have links, the network becomes all of a sudden connected in a sudden phase change. And what I think is so interesting about that is a global property of the network, whether or not it is connected entirely amongst itself. Yet that is not something that's decided by any particular node, and yet every node somehow contributes to this global property. And that's kind of what's interesting about it as a phase change. Let's apply this just a little bit to real life, right? Do you know any, or if you are a Bitcoiner, which I assume you are in this room, do you know at least one other Bitcoiner in real life? Well, yeah, of course you do, right? That's easy, right? But there was a time when that wasn't true, right? If we go back to, let's say, like 2009, 10, 11, super early days, you might be reading and encountering Bitcoin online, and no one you know knows anything about Bitcoin. So my claim is in that scenario, Bitcoin was not connected, right? Our social structure as a community was not connected. Now we know it is connected, right? Everybody knows at least one person who's in Bitcoin, and that means that every node has at least one link, and that means the network has gone through the phase transition, and that means we are a community. So I think that's pretty interesting. I think you'd also apply the same kind of thinking to the Lightning Network, right? We want the Lightning Network to be connected because we want to be able to move sats through those money tubes across the entire network. And so one way to think about that is the Lightning Network connected? Well, does every node in the Lightning Network have approximately one channel to another node? And the answer is approximately yes. There are about 10,000 Lightning Network nodes, and there's about 30,000 channels. So yeah, approximately it should be connected. And indeed it is. Everybody who's used the Lightning Network knows that it works. And part of the reason it works is because it is indeed connected. And we'll get to the next idea, which is path length. Not only is it connected, but it's efficient, right? This is another pretty cool idea in network science, which is the notion that a network can have a huge number of nodes, but a relatively small path length in order to get from one node to another on average, right? On the Lightning Network, there's 10,000 nodes approximately, but it only takes on average 3 to 4 hops to traverse the entire network, right? Something similar is happening all the time on the internet. When you're getting packets from wherever you're getting them from, there are billions of devices on the internet, but you're able to route very quickly with maybe 10 to 15 hops if you're going all the way across the world. You sometimes maybe hear of this as like 6 degrees of separation, right? There's like famous study, which is maybe a little bit apocryphal and whatever, but if you've ever heard that phrase or that game, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, like that's characteristic of communities, right? So I'm sure there's some sort of 6 degrees of Satoshi that we could play, right? It's like how many steps are you away from Satoshi or whoever, Hal Finney, or pick anybody else, right, in the Bitcoin network. Interesting game to play. I bet the number is less than 6, right? The idea is that this is logarithmic in the number of nodes. So pretty cool idea. How am I doing on time? Okay. Scale-free networks. This is another cool idea. Like a lot of networks look like this. They look like fractals. They look like bacteria growing in a dish, which is also a weird fractal phenomena, right? They're self-similar. And why does this happen? Like there's a theory that this largely happened because of the phenomenon of preferential attachment, right? This is the notion that if a new node joins the network, that node will create a link to nodes which already have a large number of links, which is to say hubs, right? That hubs are the most likely nodes to receive new links when they join the network. And this leads to a kind of rich get richer type effect it's sometimes referred to as in the literature. Like, isn't this kind of what's going on with the Lightning Network? Let's think about it. If you put a Lightning node up, to which node are you most likely to create your first channel? Will it be to a node that has no other channels? Or will it be to a very well-connected hub so that you can instantly get liquidity and route easily and so on? So I think whether we intended to or not, we are practicing preferential attachment in the Lightning Network, and we are likely to generate a scale-free network, which is pretty interesting. Also make a side note that one of the cool things about scale-free networks is they're characterized by power law distributions in the number of hubs that exist and the size of that hub. So when I first heard last year Bitcoiners were really getting into power laws, I thought they had finally discovered complexity theory and network science, and that turned out not to be the case. That's all right. This guy here is actually really cool, Alberto Barabasi. You can ignore the fact that the background is the World Economic Forum. Don't hold that against the guy. He's done a lot of really good research, and I think most recently wrote a really nice paper about analyzing NFT networks for art. And maybe I should stop talking about him. I should move on. Okay, next guy. I think this is really interesting too. This is assortativity and robustness. These are some interesting metrics for how to talk about. Now, when Parker and I had a pretty interesting conversation about this, I think a month or two ago when we were talking. So it's a pretty simple idea, right? How are networks robust against purposeful attack or outage, right? So the one on the left, right, is what we might call an assortative network, or a network that has hub attraction, in which hubs are likely to connect to other hubs. And networks like this tend to be really strong, right? It's difficult to knock out a single node and have the network fall apart. Whereas the network on the right, which is you might call disassortative, in which hubs kind of repel each other, they don't want to connect to each other, is less robust, right? Because I can sort of chop it in half because it's not over-connected in some ways. Now, you kind of would prefer to have assortative networks in general, except that disassortative networks are easier and cheaper to make often. If these links have a cost associated to them, right? If those links represent roads or flight routes or lightning payment channels, right? What we tend to find is that technological networks that grow that way become disassortative over time. That's just their natural thing. And in order to correct that, you have to take some sort of action, some planning action, or create incentives to have them be more assortative. Which networks are the most assortative? Social networks, right? That's because it doesn't cost us anything to follow somebody on Twitter. So we'll just do it, right? And then hubs will connect to more hubs, and you get a network which is deeply, deeply connected and difficult to break apart, which is, it is what it is for social networks. Okay. So I think it's really interesting to ask these kinds of questions about the Lightning Network. Is the Lightning Network characterized by incentives which will lead to disassortativity or to assortativity? And in general, I think this is an interesting question about networks of keys in general. So let's keep going. That was the end of the crash course. Let's bring it back to Bitcoin, right? Let's start with layer one. Okay, I'm doing good. Let's start with layer one. Okay, so Bitcoin keys, as originally created in the world, were not a network. They were disconnected from each other, right? Like each person who was custodying, let's say they're practicing self-custody on their own. In this diagram, there are the little oranges. The blues have totally disappeared. That was the wrong color to choose, but there's these big blue circles. Those are meant to be custodians, right? But none of these people are collaborating in any meaningful way, right? You've got individuals holding keys on their own, and you've got giant institutions holding keys and creating centralization risk and so on. And maybe every once in a while, one of the hodlers loses their keys, and more or less frequently, but more tragically, one of these custodians gets hacked and attacked and loses their keys. This was the picture of Bitcoin, let's say, when it first came out. Um, but this is kind of a false choice. These aren't the only two options, right? There's a spectrum of custody options between having to do everything yourself and depending on absolutely nobody else versus doing very little yourself and depending almost 100% on a third-party delegate to do everything for you, right? We know that collaborative custody exists. I've given this slide 25 times, right? Collaborative custody is a blend between these two options and one that I think is superior and that I personally use. And in fact, I had to build a whole entire company just to be able to access. Collaborative custody has this notion of a key agent, someone that holds a private key that you use in your Bitcoin wallet that will sign transactions on your behalf, right? They work for you. But this is the beginning of creating connections in the network of keys. When you engage in collaborative custody, when you choose key agents, you are forging that connection. And I think this starts to get really interesting because this is the way that we eliminate single points of failure from Bitcoin at layer one. Except we haven't gone as far as we need to go. Right? It's not just Unchained that does this. There's a host of different providers now in the space that are providing collaborative custody, but this is what the network of keys looks like right now. It looks like a bunch of hubs with spokes around them. All the Unchained clients are collaborating with Unchained. All the Casa clients are collaborating with Casa, and so on. Never shall the twain meet. Now, this reminds me of kind of in that very first slide, we haven't seen that phase change yet, right? The average key in Bitcoin is not connected to at least one other key. Therefore, the network overall cannot possibly be connected. That's sort of trivial. We know that. Moreover, isn't there an element of disassortativity going on here? That we have these hubs that are reticent and yet have not connected to each other? Might it be better to work in a more assortative model, where companies on that list on the right are beginning to build wallets where their keys are also combined? Looking at you, Becca. I think there's a lot of interesting options when we start to collaborate and grow out this network in more interesting ways. And Unchained is really pushing in this area, right? Independent of what other companies are doing, we want to create this behavior because we think it's more robust. So we've launched in this past year our connections features. Previously, you would have to have 2 out of the 3 keys, and Unchained would have that third key. Now we're allowing that structure to become richer and more open over time. I want to make it clear, I'm really proud of the team for putting something like this out. This is a hard feature to build. Right? This is not as simple as, well, just replace one guy's key with the third guy's key. You have to have a really complex multi-tenant web application with a sophisticated permissions model that allows you to model exactly what participants in this process should see and should not be able to see. Right? Just because you're collaborating doesn't mean you want to surrender full control. It's one of the hardest parts of collaboration is limiting and allowing control over the information that is shared to be exactly what you want it to be. So I'm really excited about these options because I think they make it easier for people to enter the network of keys. I'll talk about the one on the left to start out with. This is just the notion that you can, let's say, collaborate with a parent who might not be ready to hold 2 out of the 3 keys, have them hold just 1 out of the 3 keys. You can hold the second one, and Unchained will hold the third. I love this model. I do this with my dad. I do this with my uncles. I do this with a bunch of family members who were not ready to be given the full responsibility of holding 2 keys, but for whom I did not want to expose to centralization pressure at a place like Coinbase. This was a great solution. I'm part of their quorum. Unchained is part of their quorum. Over time, as they get better, as they learn to do their device checks better, as they become more confident and less prone to spear phishing or other forms of attack that are prevalent for people who self-custody, maybe they'll graduate to being able to hold 2 out of their own 3 keys. I really like that. And then this other model on the right is another option. You don't have to have any keys. If you have 2 children, each of them could hold a key for you. And now you are getting the benefits of self-custody from people that you trust without ever having to hold a key yourself. Now, not everybody wants to hold keys with family members. I get it. It's not a requirement. It's just an option. It doesn't have to be limited to just family members, right? This can also be colleagues. This can be friends. This can be other companies that serve as key agents on our platform over time. Our goal is to make this behavior something that's common and well understood as a best practice. It doesn't have to be on our platform. As I said, there's many platforms doing this. It can even start to become a cross-platform. But we want to live in a world where we've experienced that phase change, right? Where the network has grown to the place where it should never occur that the loss or compromise or seizure of a key should lead to the loss or compromise or seizure of Bitcoin, right? We need to avoid that outcome. All right, let's quickly bring it up to layer 2 and we'll kind of end the show here. Okay, again, the Lightning Network. Let's talk about that. The Lightning Network is also creating connections, right? On some like kind of caveman level, a Lightning payment channel really is just a multisig. It's a 2 of 2 multisig. It has additional behaviors and rules and constraints, but it really is a multisig in which 2 participants are connecting to each other. This is not a key agent-based relationship. One does not work on behalf of the other. It's a more collaborative, peer-based relationship in which they're going to use this to be able to send a huge number of fast, cheap, scalable transactions inside that payment channel. And then, of course, the network itself is just a giant network of these payment channels to which all the ideas that we were thinking about, like path lengths, community structure, scale-free structure, disassortativity, have to apply. In fact, I think in Lightning, something that's not appreciated yet is that the knowledge of the topology of the Lightning Network is something you use to make money. If you know the route from one place to another in the Lightning Network, you are the one that can make that payment. Today, we operate in a source-routed context where every Lightning node knows the topology of the whole network, but that's because the Lightning Network is still small. We're still early. When we get to the point where the Lightning Network becomes massive, starts to rival the actual scale and size of the internet, source routing will not be possible anymore. We will have to move to a more complex intermediate model. And there are some ideas, trampoline payments and other kinds of things that people are already experiencing and working with. But what's so interesting is in that world, the person who makes the payment does not know how to make the payment. They're just requesting to make the payment. Someone else who knows how to get there in the network shows up and helps provide and actually complete that payment and then gets paid for it. So we get to a place where network topology is something that like knowledge of which makes you money, the optimization of which lets you take market share. Right? So I would imagine, even if we're not doing it today, in 10 years, people who are running major Lightning nodes have network theorists working for them, taking measures of clustering coefficients and path lengths and assortativity and disassortativity as best as they can scrape from their knowledge of the network. Pretty interesting. Another idea, which I've been learning about more and more recently, these Fedi mints. Like this diagram looks very similar to the diagram that I just showed a few minutes ago, that spectrum between self-custody and relying on a third party, except here in the middle, Fedi mints want to think about it as community custody instead of collaborative custody. It's pretty much the same idea, just with a larger group of people, right? A community instead of a small quorum of direct people that you trust. I mean, I think Fedi mints are, again, connections in this network of keys that we're building. And the whole idea of being able to scale, I forgot to say it, Lightning obviously is a proposed solution for scaling Bitcoin payments. I think Fedi Mint is interesting because it's a potential solution for scaling Bitcoin payments, but also custody, right? The notion is that the guardians in the mint are actually custodying that coin in some level, and they're the keys that are being connected in the network. Just to close, and how do I do on time here? Pretty good. Just to close here, I want to make it clear that these different networks from these different projects like Lightning and Fedi Mint and what Unchained and other collaborative custodians are doing at layer 1, these aren't separate disconnected networks. They are themselves connected, as well as are many things that I didn't even draw here, right? Things like ARC or alternative layer 2s, things like side chains like Liquid or other things. These are all examples of stuff that lives in this network of keys. And moreover, these support each other and help each other. We don't want to be in a world where we're trying to build layer 2s, but layer 1 is incredibly centralized, right? That's a very brittle world to be in. We want to be in a world where people are learning at layer 1 how to manage their own keys, how to take that responsibility on. That's going to create more people who are prepared and capable to deliver excellent service as guardians in a mint or as operators of a Lightning node. And things like Fedi Mint and Lightning, these aren't necessarily even competitive networks. They're complementary, right? We want Fedi Mints to be able to pay other Fedi Mints through direct Lightning payments and connect them to the Lightning networks. All of these things are connected, and ultimately, these networks are going to get really big. And as I said, like we want to understand their topology, their structure. We want to be able to talk sensibly about it. We want Bitcoiners to be running the studies on these things, not random scientists from 4 years ago who make conclusions about Lightning based on what it looked like 4 years ago and don't update their work because it's not that interesting to them. We want to be the ones putting out this research. We want to be the experts on this. Ultimately, it's going to help scale Bitcoin, and we might even get paid to do it. All right, that's the talk. Thank you, everybody.